All right, welcome back. I've not recorded a value of growth lecture in a long time. I kind of completed the series, although it dawned on me a week or so ago that I never recorded my lectures on risk, which are part of the series. As I moved towards the value of growth book, as I was looking through the chapters that I have been working on, I didn't have a chapter on risk because I realized I hadn't recorded a lecture on risk. All right, so I'm going to give really a four-part series. It's easier to break up the videos into four parts just to make them a bit more digestible, although this is the first of them. I suspect I'll post all four at the same time. We'll see what happens. All right, so here is kind of the elements of the kind of the overview. You have risk versus uncertainty. I'm going to define investment risk and show that it includes three elements. I want to talk about risk and the Italian cookie, which comes from my value of growth series. You have to talk about volatility, obviously, risk management, and then the relationship between risk and research, which I think is kind of cool. All right, today in this lecture, I'm going to really focus on risk versus uncertainty. Now, this is a quote. We actually have this in Pitch the Perfect, but I'm always surprised that people don't remember it. So here's a quote that Howard Marks likes to talk about, which he attributes to Elroy Dimson. If there's ever been a better British name than Elroy Dimson, I've not heard it, which is great. He is an emeritus professor of finance at London Business School. I was having lunch with Jim Osman, who runs The Edge, which he works on spins and things like that in special situations. And he actually had Elroy Dimson as a professor when he was at the London Business School. So the guy apparently exists. Okay, so here's the quote. Risk means more things can happen than will happen. And I think Howard Marks likes to point this out to say, hey, listen, the world is uncertain and therefore more things can happen than will happen. And I always ask my students in class to agree or disagree. Most of my students agree. And then I challenge them. And I say, here's a quote we did have in Pitch the Perfect Investment. This is from Paul and Paul. Uncertainty means more things can happen than will happen. And this subtlety is really important. Elroy Dimson is wrong. Howard Marks quoting him is effectively wrong. It's uncertainty means more things can happen than will happen. Separating risk from uncertainty is absolutely, without a question, the first and foremost step to understanding risk. All right, this example we did use in Pitch the Perfect, but I like coming back to it. If you're given a lottery ticket, you don't buy one, you're given a lottery ticket. Is that risk or uncertainty? And a lot of people will say they realize that's uncertainty. There's the uncertain outcome. Now, I always joke that there's no uncertainty. I promise you, you're not going to win. But effectively, there's uncertainty, but there is no risk. And this always starts to get people to think, oh, wait a minute, hold on a second. There is something here that's important. Now, if you go out and you buy a lottery ticket, is that risk or uncertainty? Well, the trick question is it's risk and uncertainty. The uncertainty didn't go away, but now you have purchased the ticket, you have something you can lose, which is the purchase price. Now, it's fun in class because the students always say, whoa, no, opportunity cost, all kinds of crazy things. No, if you're given a lottery ticket, it's only uncertainty. If you buy a lottery ticket, it's risk and uncertainty. And this is, as far as I'm concerned, the most important first step to understanding risk. So what's the difference? The potential for loss. So I'm old school. I think of risk as loss or harm or something that you don't want in your life. So I think of it as potential of loss. Easy way to think about it. All right, so here's an exercise I do. A little bit harder to do online, but I'll try for a moment. So what I have people do is read this paragraph slowly to yourself. Obviously, you're probably watching on your own. Read the sentence, and then after each sentence, ask yourself how you feel, which is kind of a crazy thing to do when we talk about risk, but you'll see in a minute it's related. And as you go through it, read the sentence, how do you feel? Read the next sentence, how do you feel? Read the next sentence, how do you feel? And go all the way through it. I'm going to pause for a moment, which is weird on an online video, but just so you can do it. I want to give people a chance to kind of think through it. So read each of the sentences slowly, and then ask yourself, what's going on? Now, most people, this causes some level of anxiety or some level of confusion or some level of frustration. I've got all kinds of responses. But it does trigger for a lot of people an unsettled feeling. And that's really what I'm trying to capture. Now, it's a question. How does it make you feel? Unsettled. For most people, unsettled. Now, what you do have is a lot of people will start to come up with a cognitive overlay. What do I mean by that? The cognitive overlay is they try to explain it away. But it's that cognitive effort, that cognitive load where you're trying to reduce the ambiguity of the statements. Now, that discomfort is ambiguity. We as humans, put myself there, do not like ambiguity in general. Sometimes it's fun, but most of the time it causes some level of discomfort. All right, now I put this in place because I want to do a setup. I'm going to prime you all now. I'm going to say a single word. I'm going to show it in the next slide. And I want you to think about how that affects, priming is we set something up on purpose. Think about the paragraph. So here's the word, kite. Say it out loud. Kite for a lot of people. Some people don't know what it means, so I put a picture on the side. Now, go back and reread the paragraph. Well, I primed you with the word kite, and if the priming's done any effect, as you read this, it makes more sense, right? A newspaper is better than a magazine, meaning the newspaper itself makes a better kite than a magazine pages. A seashore is a better place than a street because in theory, your mind would go to a visual where the street is more congested than a seashore. At first, it's better to run than to walk. All right, so now all of a sudden with the word kite, that ambiguity goes away. You're feeling less ambiguity, which for most people is comforting, interesting, right? But why? That's the question. Why? If the notion is you're primed with the word kite, you start reading these sentences, they make sense. Whereas a moment ago, they didn't make sense, right? That's the key. And then how do you know kite is the correct answer? I've just set you up. This is an experiment I did not create. I stole this from an author. I thought it was really terrific. I've given it a number of times. I still find it to be terrific. It's great, right? So what if I gave you a different explanation? What if I said this was just a poem? This was random sentences by third graders or something like that. No, kite just feels right. It feels right. The moment you do it, it just feels right. And that's kind of the key insight. But you do have to ask yourself the question, why are you so confident now when a moment ago you were confused? And that is part of this process of understanding how we as humans deal with uncertainty and ambiguity, right? Your confidence is based on a feeling. And for a lot of people, they're like, so what? This is really important. We tend to think about research and investing and analytics as a cognitive process. But in fact, when it comes around to uncertainty and ambiguity, it's really a feeling. Those are emotions, not cognitive process, which is it. And it's what we call a feeling of knowing, In fact, most of our confidence that we get in what we believe to be true comes from that, a feeling of knowing, which is important. All right, set up some vocabulary. Ambiguity is something that's unclear. Uncertainty is something that's unknown. Ambiguity is lack of clarity or misunderstanding. Uncertainty is incomplete knowledge or some random stochastic natured process. All right. Ambiguity and uncertainty cause in our mind, the technical term is open mental account. An open mental account means something that is unresolved. We generally do not like open mental accounts. It causes cognitive load, and we as a species are really trained to minimize cognitive load as much as possible. And we don't like open mental accounts, particularly ambiguous ones, and particularly ones around important issues, health, money, family, and things like that. That's really important. And the mind, this is what's crazy, the mind prefers to resolve uncertainty, ambiguity quickly. In fact, there are lots of studies that suggest we'd rather settle for a suboptimal outcome today than a much better outcome tomorrow. That's how much we as humans, I include myself, don't like ambiguity and uncertainty. Kind of crazy. All right, and both give you a sense of not knowing, which feels uncomfortable. That's the key insight. All right, so we care about this because uncertainty is a component of risk. And as I said, they both cause anxiety and stress, particularly in high-stress situations, high-stakes situations, of course. All right, so how do we think we deal with uncertainty? kind of how we know what we know, how we know what we think we know with a high degree of certainty. We believe what we do is we study the evidence, right? We go collect all this data and evidence, and then we weigh the pros and cons on each side, and then we decide. But they're strong. The evidence is pretty strong that we're convinced, we're certain there's no other. Apologize. If the evidence is strong enough, then we're convinced, certain that there's no other reasonable answer. I'm getting ahead of myself because obviously I set this up because it's just not true. And your resulting sense of certainty feels like the only logical and justifiable outcome to a conscious and deliberate line of reasoning, right? Study the evidence, weigh the pros and cons, then decide. The evidence is strong enough, we have a high degree of confidence, blah, blah, blah. And that logical process, if you will, that deliberate line of reasoning leads to what can only be the logical outcome. But it's a feeling of knowing. That's the key. All right, so here's a great book published in 2008. This guy's a neurologist, pretty good credentials here. And he wrote a book called On Being Certain. And he was really studying the chemical, biological, physiological effects of certainty and confidence and stuff like that. And this is what he says in the book. It's really great. The evidence is overwhelming. The answer is startling and counterintuitive, yet unavoidable. And that is, despite how certainty feels, is neither a conscious choice nor even a thought process. Certainty and similar states of knowing what we know arise out of involuntary brain mechanisms that, like love or anger, function independent of reason. The last part's my highlight. So we really have to understand this about us. Us humans, uncertainty is really related to this feeling of knowing. And that's where confidence comes from. Confidence is that feeling of knowing. It just feels right. Of course it feels right. The problem, of course, is it's not based on logic and deliberate thinking and gathering evidence and all that. Despite what you think, it is not. It is not. And therefore, one should be a little bit careful about the certainty, their feeling of certainty that they have. All right, I stole this from a guy named Peter Atwater, a book called The Confidence Gap. And he set up this 2x2 matrix. Obviously, it's a standard tool. I use them a lot. On the left is this idea of certainty. You go low to high. On the bottom is control, sense of control, low to high. That's sort of the setup. Now, uncertainty would be obviously the opposite of certainty. So I just want to set those both up because it's important. All right. So we strive for certainty. We strive for certainty. That's just who we are, human being. Uncertainty, ambiguity, high mental load. We don't like that. Causes anxiety, causes us a feeling of not knowing, not good. So we strive for certainty all the time. And it's kind of funny. End of the day stock market commentary. My dad used to say the stock market, he said that the thing is always impressed by Wall Street. They always can explain what happened at the end of the day. He said it might be more valuable if you could explain what's going to happen at the beginning of the day, but they could always explain at the end. Post-election analysis. We've had 2 or 3 really big elections over the last 10 years. And, after the fact, everyone could explain and some of those elections had surprises. And after the fact, everyone could explain what happened, who turned out, who didn't, who voted, who didn't, all of that. But the day before, they're all talking about what's going to happen with a great deal of uncertainty. But after the fact, that uncertainty's gone away. And we give a great post-election analysis, which I find amusing. And then, of course, we do that with economic results as well. So we strive for certainty. We just do not like uncertainty. We do not like uncertainty as a human race. All right. So we strive to explain cause and effect. Looking backwards, kind of crazy. All right. As Atwater says in his book, it's really a feeling of certainty and a feeling of control. These aren't facts. These are just feelings. And he set this up in a good way. So if you have a low feeling of control and a low feeling of certainty or a high feeling of uncertainty, the opposite, you feel vulnerable, lower left corner. And if you have a high feeling of certainty and a high feeling of control, you're feeling confident in the upper right-hand corner. Makes sense, right? Now, what happens is when you're feeling confident, often you're feeling fearless, low sense of vulnerability, high expectation, low perceived risk, right? This is where that overconfidence can come from. You're feeling overconfident. And in the stock market, how do we know that? High expectations, high valuations, right? All right. On the other extreme, feeling vulnerable, you feel fearful, high sense of vulnerability, low expectation, high perceived risk. That's really important. And that, we think about that being a panic or something like that. And that tends to result in lower valuations and lower investor expectation, which is key. All right. I took some liberty. Atwater calls this the passenger seat and the driver, and he calls it something else, but I call it the passenger seat and the driver's seat. I don't know. That seemed parallel. He did not call it the driver's seat. So I apologize to the original. So if you have a low sense of control but a high sense of certainty, you're sort of in the passenger seat. If you have a high sense of control but a low sense of certainty, a high sense of uncertainty, you're in the driver's seat. You have some control. So we either strive for certainty or control. At a bare minimum, we strive for certainty or control. That's the key. Now, risk tolerance is subjective rather than an objective concept. And it's highly influenced by perceptions of uncertainty and sense of control. Really, really important. I'm going to go back one and just tell an interesting story. If you think about a flight, a 777 going out of JFK for Europe, let's talk about three experiences. The pilot, a business traveler who makes the trip several times a year, and an older couple on their first trip to Europe ever. And the first time they've ever been on a wide body, first time they've ever been on an overseas trip. You hit a bunch of turbulence as you come out of Kennedy. If you're the pilot, you've been through that hundreds of times. It doesn't cause anything. You react naturally. No problem. High degree of certainty, high degree of control. The business traveler travels a lot, been through a lot of turbulence, not as much as the pilot, has no control whatsoever, but a high degree of confidence. They're in the upper left corner. But think about that couple that has never been on a wide body, never flown overnight to Europe, never really experienced bad turbulence. They have neither a sense of control or a sense of certainty, and they can be feel quite vulnerable in the lower left. Same experience, literally, but same events, much different personal experience, which is key. That's why that risk tolerance is subjective rather than objective, which is key. All right, so as uncertainty increases, we often feel vulnerable. So our sense of vulnerability increases, right? We do it there. And a trusted investment process returns a sense of control. This is why having a process is so critical. It's in moments of uncertainty where you're feeling vulnerable, you can restore a sense of control through a very robust investment process, which is critical. All right, so what we've been able to do is uncertainty is something that is unknown. Key insight, often priced as risk. That's the key insight. Price is risk. We're going to come back to that in more of these lectures. All right, so let's talk about Nassim Taleb. No one has done more on uncertainty and risk, in my mind, than Taleb in his books. All right, so what Taleb says, which I really like, you need to consider alternative histories. We tend to get locked into the one history that did unfold. All right, so certainty is something that is likely to take place across the highest number of different alternative histories. That, to me, is a pretty good way to think about it. Uncertainty concerns events that should take place in the lowest number of them. So certainty would be around something you think that will happen in most future outcomes. That should be certainty. And uncertainty would be those random things that are really idiosyncratic or really unusual scenarios. I just thought that was a very good way to think about certainty and uncertainty. All right, so now risk is the possibility of loss or injury or harm. I talked about that up front. You want to try to avoid risk or at least get paid for it. And I think that's a good way to think about it. All right, I'm going to define investment risk. So investment risk is uncertainty plus a commitment of capital plus a potential loss. We need all three of those. And I'm going to delve into this over the lectures. All three are really important. So uncertainty plus a commitment of capital plus the potential loss. We need all three, and we'll talk a bit about that as well. And really important, there's no risk if there's no uncertainty. So it all starts with uncertainty, which is really important. All right. Therefore, there's no risk after the trade is closed out because the uncertainty is gone. And that's something we need to talk about because after the fact, people say, oh, it wasn't that risky of a trade. You don't know. You cannot make that statement because the moment the trade is closed out, there's no uncertainty. Therefore, arguably, there was no risk. You can't make that next step. Really important. So the outcome tells you nothing about the underlying distribution. The underlying risk, you just don't know. You don't know if the initial trade was risky or not. So this is one of those weird things about risk. After the fact, you have to be very careful, very, very careful. All right, alternative histories, come back to that. All right, so as Taleb says, many things could have happened in each of the cases in the past. The fact that only one did happen understates the variability that existed. And that's really important. We have this false sense of historical distribution, false sense of the range of uncertainty historically, right? The history that took place is only one version of what could have happened. And it gives you no information on the distribution, but more importantly is it gives you no information on the distribution, which is key. And so the relevance of that history, the future, is much more limited than appears to be the case. Because we don't know those historical distributions, we therefore, almost by definition, it gives us, history gives us no sense of future distribution. So be very careful about overfitting to history, because history was just one element of the potential distribution. It gives you no sense of the width of the distribution, and it gives you no sense of where you ended up on the distribution. We're going to talk a bit about that in the next lecture. All right, so there is a big difference between probabilities and outcomes, right? Outcomes are 100%. Probabilities are definitely not, by definition. And even though many things can happen, only one will happen. And that is kind of what Elroy Dimson's trying to get to. But I think it's better to think about uncertainty and risk separately, which we're going to talk about. All right, that's the end of the first lecture. Much more fun stuff to come. Thank you for listening.